All right. And in episode 9, we're going to ask Mr. Gray, where is Tertullian? I mean, this has got to be the biggest. I mean, let's put it this way. Tertullian writes an entire book debunking Paul as an apostle of Jesus Christ, using the book of Acts, using Paul's own words, using the New Testament as his proof. And this isn't mentioned. This isn't quoted. I mean, it's mentioned in passing. The book exists. The book Against Marcion is cited 9 times, but he never tells you anything in it. How in the world can you write a book about anti-Paulinism and not include Tertullian's work Against Marcion, which depended upon debunking Paul's validity? And that's when Paulinism was at its height. You had a whole movement called Marcionism, which was saying Paul's the only apostle. It was dispensationalism on steroids. He's the only apostle. Gentiles are completely apart from the Jews, and now we're just going to wander off and just follow Paul. That was Marcionism. So it was the one moment in history where you can't miss the anti-Paulinism of Tertullian. You'd have to be a moron to miss it. So he didn't miss this. He just deliberately doesn't cover it. And you got to ask yourself, why? So we're going to discuss why. We're going to discuss the issue of Tertullian and ask ourselves, what in the world was Gray thinking when he didn't include this in any substantive way? Okay, so my question here is, where is Tertullian's scathing criticism of Paul's authority as an alleged apostle of Jesus in Tertullian's book Against Marcion from 207 AD? I mean, really? Or Tertullian's comment that Paul's words fit what Jesus warned about coming from a false prophet? What about that? What about Tertullian's many biblical proofs that Paul's claim in Galatians to being an apostle of Jesus was an invalid, self-serving one, unconfirmed anywhere in the Gospels, and disproved by the events of Acts 15, where Paul had to visit the 12 to prove his doctrine on circumcision? Gray certainly at least should have quoted Tertullian's most blunt conclusion after laying out those proofs, where Tertullian tells Marcion, if there is one that makes a false claim to be Christ, much more can there be one who professes that he's an apostle of Christ. Let the apostle Paul belong to your other God, that is the New Testament God Marcion said justifies a new dispensation of faith alone with no more law. This is in Tertullian Against Marcion, Oxford University Press, 1972, 509, 511. Let's just see if these links work still. Yeah, you can read it yourself, ladies and gentlemen. Oxford University Press. You think they're lying to you? Go read it. I think you'll find it very illuminating. See also 2 of our many articles on Tertullian. Tertullian's Critique of Paul. This is from chapter 16 of Jesus' Words Only, and we have a whole thing called Tertullian's View of Paul. So I got to ask the question, how could Gray write this book and not know about any of this? Gray mentions scholarly titles on Marcion 17 times. So I mean, I'm glad I had the e-version of this, the Kindle version, because I can just type in the word Marcion and see every time he cites it. Gray has apparently read enough of Tertullian Against Marcion to cite Book 5, paragraph 21, to demonstrate Marcion esteems Paul above all other authorities, Kindle 683. Yet no mention is made of Tertullian's scathing criticisms of Paul, nor that they are present somewhere in Against Marcion. At the same time, it is not a secret that Tertullian called Paul in Against Marcion. Paul was called the apostle of the heretics. That sounds like an anti-Paul statement, doesn't it to you, ladies and gentlemen? But he doesn't include that. In Latin, it was the words hereticorum apostolos. It's not just in my book and on my website. One of the foremost Christian Protestant writers, Hans Lietzmann, cites Tertullian from 207 AD and says about Paul that, quote, the writings of Paul, the hereticorum apostolos of Tertullian, were regarded suspiciously at Rome. The only possibility is maybe Mr. Gray doesn't know Latin, but I think you could kind of look here and not even have to know Latin. Even if you pronounce it, hereticorum apostolos. Sounds like heretic apostolos. And you only have to know that in Latin, if I put O-R-U-M at the end, it means of the. So apostle of the heretics, he should, even with just a little bit of knowledge of Latin, some introduction, 10-minute lesson that the word O-R-U-M at the end of a word was a possessive form of a word. That would be all he would need to unlock what this guy, famous person, says in a famous book. Despite Tertullian saying that nothing corroborates Paul was chosen as an apostle of Jesus and Paul fits a false prophet as predicted by Jesus, quoted in my book at length, what does Gray have to say? Gray mentions this, that there was wariness of Paul by Tertullian. Wariness, that's it. But leaves it vague and never explained. Gray then never cites where the wariness in its strongest demonstrable form appears in Tertullian works. So in other words, he may cite Against Marcion numerous times in his book, but he never tells you that's where you would find anything that's negative about Paul. So, I mean, I have to tell you is, if somebody told me Tertullian is against Paul and never says anything against Paul, I wouldn't, unless I know Marcionism already, I wouldn't guess that's in what book it belongs. He's got like 32 different books I'd have to read to find where he says anything that shows wariness. I wouldn't naturally, let's put it this way, a layperson trying to find out more about Anti-Paulinism would not know to think of the book Against Marcion. So he's not even giving them a clue of what book he's talking about with this wariness. Not a clue. Yet Gray says the wariness of writers like Tertullian does not reflect any rebuke of Paul. Really? That's all he says. So the wariness of Tertullian doesn't reflect any rebuke of Paul. And that's all he has to say. He doesn't analyze it. He doesn't present any of Tertullian's quote. He just dismisses it. He waves his hands and you don't have to think about it. Oh my goodness. So let's just look at this a little bit. And I think we're going to go into a couple of quotes. Just you can decide for yourself. Is it wariness but no rebuke? How so? Now, one thing you need to know, and I put this in our summary of Tertullian. Tertullian at the end says, he gives you all these negatives about Paul. And he says, the only reason I'm holding on to Paul, he says this blatantly in his last line about Paul, is because God tells me in Genesis 49, verse 27, that he gave me Paul. So you got to read Genesis 49, 27. And in the Latin, in the Hebrew, it reads different than in the Septuagint. And Tertullian was relying upon the Septuagint translation, maybe into Latin. So in the original Hebrew, it's all negative. It says the Benjamite wolf will come in the latter days. He'll be an opponent of Messiah, who's spoken about in 49:11 through 15, from Judah, who will have the blood of grapes on his chest, on his clothing. Okay, so you've got these wonderful prophecies about Jesus and Paul in the same passage of Genesis 49. It's a prophecy of Jacob, the father of Israel. I mean, is the founder of the 12 tribes. I mean, he's talking to his 12 children. And so he says, I'm going to accept Paul because of this passage, because it tells me I have to accept Paul. But he doesn't know that the version of Genesis 49:27 he's relying upon has a mistranslation in the Greek. So what it says in Hebrew is, in the beginning of his days, he'll be a murderer. He'll kill and whatever. But in the end of his days, he will, in Hebrew it says, divide the spoil, which means he's going to eat what he's just killed. So if he kills the Gentiles, he's going to now eat and devour them in the second part of his career. Okay, that's not a good thing. But in the mistranslation of the Septuagint in Greek, it says he will distribute food. So that's how Tertullian ends it, where he says, even though I said all these horrible things, in the end I have to accept Paul because of God tells me I have to accept him in Genesis 49, verse 27. That's a very slim read upon which you can say he didn't rebuke him. He only was saying, I can't reject him entirely because I'm told that he's distributed food to me. So there's some value I'm getting out of him, the food. But otherwise, I know I've destroyed him completely. His validity, his authority, everything. My book is up to this point has been completely destructive of him and uncomplimentary and implied that he's a false prophet as well. I know all that, but I'm just telling you why I hold on to him at the very end. So I want to say that's the only argument you can make, that it's not completely a refutation of Paul, but it's a very thin reed to hold on to. And it's certainly not a basis to say that he didn't rebuke Paul, because he clearly is saying all kinds of things that there's really no basis that we should accept anything that Paul teaches in Acts about his having met Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus, because he completely deconstructs that in this work. And so I think what we're going to do is going to read some of that. So let's see how I mention this. So instead, so he says, let's go back. So Gray offers no synopsis of Tertullian's critiques that he knows expressed any level of wariness to prove that no rebuke was intended. So Tertullian doesn't explain to you anything I just told you of how I know what he means by it was no rebuke. But that means he had to have read all the book. Because to get to that last part, which I just told you, you've got to read scientifically all of the book Against Marcion until you get to that last thing and you go, okay, now I can see the only reason he isn't completely rejecting Paul entirely is just his faith that Genesis 49:27 has to mean the food I'm getting from Paul is still worth something to me, even though I've just wiped him out otherwise. I've cleaned the floor with his tuchus. Is what he really does destroy Paul in his book. I don't know why he would hold 49:27 is enough strength that you would still say I'm not going to completely reject him. Gray does not even cite Against Marcion as a place that a reader could find the most serious expressions of wariness that Tertullian had. So he doesn't even help you know what you're talking about. And I'm going to tell you why, because when I read it to you, and I'm going to read it to you, you're going to go, this completely applies to Paul. I could take this to the bank and cash this because it's such a firm destruction of Paul's validity that why are we even bothering with him? Because he asks all the right questions. Instead, Gray processes it for you, the reader, that Tertullian has awareness about Paul. He provides no explanations for its basis. Gray does so for your benefit, so you don't have to read the negative sources, know what they represent, or even know the title of the most relevant work to look up. Yet we must trust that whatever wariness Tertullian expressed is supposedly simply no rebuke at all. Really? Leitsman, quoting Against Marcion, said Tertullian viewed Paul as the apostle of the heretics. What about that? In line with a negative suspicion about Paul at Rome. But Gray knows there is supposedly no rebuke of Paul at all by Tertullian based upon some unexplained means. Amazing. So really, it truly is amazing how he came to say there was no rebuke of Paul. Not okay. Because you can't walk away and say that's what happened. He was rebuked, terribly so, but he wasn't 100% rejected. Slim read Genesis 49:27 in a mistranslated form, which I think even what a good author like Gray should have done is said, you know what? Let's analyze Genesis 49:27. Did Tertullian unnecessarily hold on to Paul? Yes, it's a mistranslation he was relying on. Oh, so he, in essence, gives us all the meat we need to reject Paul today. That's what Gray could have said, and that's what, if I wrote Gray's book, that's what I would have said. So let's look at some of the critiques of Paul by Tertullian. So I'm going to stop this video, and we'll come right back. We've only gone 11 minutes, so we got some more time to talk. So now I'm going to read next, in the next slide, Tertullian's work Against Marcion, Book 4, Chapter 2. This is page 263 and 265 of the Evans edition from Oxford University Press online. So, and I typed this up in my book. The Oxford University Press is like 8-point type for some reason. So, yeah, it has to be typed up so you can actually see it. Okay, so this is the first passage we're going to look at where he's going to deconstruct Paul. And the number one point he's going to bring up is Marcion only uses part of Luke's gospel, but he ignores Matthew, Mark, he ignores John. And so he's going to say that's basically inadequate. You can't just rely upon one. You got to look at all of them. And then also he's going to use Paul's own words that Paul said, I went to go get my gospel confirmed by the 12. I thought I might have run in vain. So that meant Paul did not have an understanding that he was equal or superior to the 12 by whatever his relationship was with Jesus. He thought he had to submit to them and had to get their approval and authority. So this is showing you in deconstructing bit by bit, Paul does not have the same authority as Jesus Christ. Okay, so let's just listen now. Now, Luke was not an apostle, Tertullian writes, but an apostolic man, not a master but a disciple, in any case less than his master, meaning Paul, and assuredly even more of lesser count as being a follower a later apostle, Paul. So Luke, by being a follower of Paul, would be even of lesser account than anybody else in the list, which is very clever, to be sure. So that even if Marcion had introduced his gospel under the name of Paul in person, that one single document would not be adequate for our faith. So he's even conjecturing, if Paul came and said, I have a gospel for you, we wouldn't accept it. Do you see what he's doing? He's telling you Paul himself cannot come to us and say he's got a gospel. We would have to reject it. Because remember, what does Paul say? My gospel, my gospel, my gospel. So So Tertullian is telling you that whole sequence, I wouldn't. That's illegitimate in principle, because it would be if it was destitute of the support of Paul's predecessors, the 12 apostles. So if the 12 don't agree with Paul, see, and this is the big question mark, leaving the book of Acts, you don't get the idea that James has any clue that Paul's teaching a different gospel than he is. He thinks he's preaching a very law-abiding gospel, and that, faith, works worthy of repentance, and all this kind of stuff is being quoted by Paul out loud under oath. So this is what is the impression given at that point. So Paul could not give a different gospel that the 12 don't approve of, and we have no evidence that ever happened. I'm interjecting a little bit here. For we should demand the production of that gospel also which Paul found in existence, and to which he gave his assent, that with which shortly afterwards he was anxious that his own should agree. For his intention in going up to Jerusalem to know and to consult the apostles was lest perchance he had run in vain, that is, lest perchance he had not believed as they did, or were not preaching the gospel in their manner. So you see, Paul's own words are being used against him. He does not have an authority equal to 12, and he knows it. And some people say, well, Tertullian isn't relying upon the Bible to prove anything against Paul. So so this isn't a Bible-based argument. This is completely Bible-based. He's using Paul's own words. You've heard them. I went up to Jerusalem to make sure perchance I did not run in vain. That is Paul's own words are being used against him. He did not have an authority equal to 12, and he knew it. At length, when Paul had conferred with the original apostles, and there was agreement concerning the rule of the faith, they joined right hands of fellowship. Okay, so now you have to know what that means. You have to look at all the book of Acts, because you can see James in chapter 21 has no clue Paul is teaching a lawless gospel, that the law is gone. He's telling Paul, I want you to do the vow from the book of Numbers to prove that this idea that you're teaching against the law is completely false, and everybody will know it by your obedience to this Nazirite vow. And then Paul agrees to do it, and does it for 7 days. And just as he was getting to the end of it, then this controversy happened with Trophimus violating the temple's sacred grounds in an uncircumcised state. So anyway, back to this. If he, Paul, therefore, who gave the light to Luke, chose to have his predecessor's authority, that is the 12, for his faith as well as his preaching, much more must I require for Luke's gospel the authority, i.e. from the 12, which was necessary for the gospel of his master Paul. So he's actually saying to Marcion, you're relying only on the book of Luke as your only gospel, your only record of what Jesus taught. And he's saying, I would have to require more of that, anyway. So that's not enough to base your whole movement, and you can't depart from us because you just got this one gospel of Luke. Much more I would require for Luke's gospel the authority from which was necessary for Paul to have his gospel, which was not. In other words, Paul's gospel could not have been based on Luke's gospel, because Luke's gospel didn't even exist when Paul is circulating in the book of Acts, right? And so this is a very clever argument. So he's saying, Marcion, you can't rely just on Luke's gospel, because Paul didn't rely upon that when he went to the 12. That's not the gospel Paul had to verify himself against. It wasn't Luke's gospel. So he is deconstructed in one blow, in one short thing. He's deconstructed all of the proofs of Marcion. You can't rely only on Luke, and you can't rely only on Paul. You've got to have the gospels that came before, and that's Matthew, that's Mark, and that's also, by this time, John. But I think he's really talking about Matthew and Mark, because those would have pre-existed at the time of when Paul went up to Jerusalem to get his authority confirmed. Okay, so this is part 1, and there's a couple more passages I want to read to you so you can just get the gist of what Gray is not including. Can you imagine not including this? It's just unfathomable to me. Okay, so this is, I typed this up in the book, Jesus' Words Only. This is page 417 of the book. I desire to hear from Marcion the origin of Paul the Apostle. I'm a sort of new disciple, having had instruction from no other teacher. For the moment, my only belief is that nothing ought to be believed without good reason, and that is believed without good reason, which is believed without knowledge of. We'll pause for a minute. Okay, we'll continue. Its origin, and I must with the best of reasons approach this inquiry with uneasiness when I find one affirmed to be an apostle, of whom in the list of the apostles in the gospel I find no trace. So when I am told that he, Paul, was subsequently promoted by our Lord, by now at rest in heaven, I find some lack of foresight in the fact that Christ did not know beforehand that he would have need of him. Do you see he's questioning the validity of Paul's apostleship? Anybody? Can you see that? But after setting in order the office of apostleship and sending them out upon their duties, considered it necessary on an impulse and not by deliberation to add another, by compulsion, so to speak, and not by design. He's talking about the road to Damascus. So did you ever think about that? Is Jesus has done everything through chapter 1 of book of Acts to pick the 12th apostle to replace Judas, and that's all set in order, and now some guy's killing and murdering your people, and you meet him on a road to Damascus. Now, you don't call him an apostle there, but he's claiming that you made him an apostle sometime in the future. Why would you, Jesus, be like forced into this position where you had to pick this enemy and make him an apostle? Why? And he's a murderer and a blasphemer. Aren't blasphemers unpardonably not forgiven? Very strange. Very strange. So then, shipmaster of Pontus, so he means Marcion, supposing you have never accepted into your craft any smuggled or illicit merchandise, have never appropriated or adulterated any cargo, and in the things of God are even more careful and trustworthy, will you please tell us under what bill of lading you accepted Paul as apostle? Who has stamped him with that mark of a distinction? Who commended him to you, and who put him in your charge? Now, just pause. There is no reference anywhere in the book of Acts in chapter 9, 22, or 26 that Paul was picked by Jesus to be an apostle of Jesus Christ. That is solely coming from Paul's own words, that he has been told that by Jesus somehow, somewhere, in some place and time. But it's not recorded that Jesus says that about Paul in the book of Acts, not once. And there were 3 chances it could have happened. And Paul got at least 1 chance, no, 2 times with the accounts. The only account Luke gives that is his own is Acts 9, where you don't know where he's getting it from. But Acts 22 and 26 would have been Paul's chance. He's telling everybody the Damascus Road experience, and he doesn't include mention that he had been picked as an apostle of Jesus Christ. Not at all. Which makes me believe that he only told the people he was preaching to who were Gentiles. He told that. But he didn't dare say it in front of the 12, because they would have gone, no, there's 12. There's only 12. And when we die, it dies with us. So we continue, though. Only so may you with confidence disembark him, Paul. Only so can he avoid being proved to belong to him who has put in evidence all the documents that attest his apostleship. So what did I just show you? There's 0. There's no documents from any corroborative source. Now he's going to, the next sentence, he's going to address the counter argument of Marcion, which is that Paul says he's an apostle. He, Paul himself, says Marcion claims to be an apostle, and that not from men nor through any man, but through Jesus Christ. Now this is it, ladies and gentlemen. Listen to this. Clearly, any man can make claims for himself, but his claim is confirmed by another person's attestation. So in other words, this still is true even if you include all the apostles, even if you include all the Gospels, every document in the New Testament. You looked at every single document. The only person who says that Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ is Paul himself. Not once is it corroborated in Acts 9, 22, 26, in any of the appearance accounts, even 2 of which Paul himself is recounting. Okay? So and in none of the other, Peter in 2 Peter calls him a brother, not an apostle. See? So there is a complete absence. So anybody can make a claim for themselves, but Jesus says it must be corroborated by two witnesses, eyewitnesses, and there's not even one witness. There's one witness, and he is a self-interested party. So clearly, any man can make claims for himself, and again, that's why everybody must review Tertullian's arguments, because they're valid. They're valid no matter what you consider from the New Testament. They're still valid points. One person writes the document, another signs it, a third attests the signature, and a fourth enters it in the records. No man is for himself, both claimant and witness. Duh. There you go. Besides this, you have found it written that many will come and say. Now, he's now going to use Jesus' prophecy of the sign of the Son of Man to preclude Paul. Now, I want you to know something. He knows, like anyone else, that Jesus says in the same context that he's quoting him right now, that I'm not coming back unless it's universally seen. People are going to say they've seen me in the wilderness. They're going to say I am Christ, and Jesus is saying don't listen to them because I have to be universally seen by everybody on earth at the same time. So he's quoting from this passage. This is intelligent, but it's interesting. He's just going to pick one part of it out. But you and I should be thinking of all of the things Jesus said in the sign of the Son of Man prophecy. But let's listen to what he says. Besides this, you have found it written that many will come and say, I am Christ. If there is one that makes a false claim to be Christ, much more can there be one who professes that he is an apostle of Christ. So this is very clever. So he didn't even go to the full sign of Son of Man. He's just simply saying, if people can pretend to be Christ and try to get away with it, why wouldn't people claim to be apostle and try to get away with it? I mean, this is perfect argument. Perfect rebuttal to Paul. And still stands to this day, is completely valid. There's no refutation of these arguments. Thus far, my converse has been in the guise of a disciple and an inquirer. From now on, I propose to shatter your confidence, for you have no means of proving, and I have to go to the next page, so I'm going to put this on a pause. Hold on. So he says, I propose to shatter your confidence, for you have no means of proving its validity, and to shame your presumption, since you make claims but reject the means of establishing them. Let the apostle belong to your other God, yet you have no proof of it except from the Creator's archives. So now he's going to say the only way you could prove he's an apostle is from the Creator's archives. You may argue, and do you then deny that Paul is an apostle? So now Marcion's trying to put him in a box. Are you going to say he's not an apostle? And really what Tertullian's going to reply in is, I don't have to prove he's an apostle or not. I could accept him as my apostle. You, Marcion, have to claim he's your apostle and prove he is your apostle. You don't have any proof. Okay, so, and then this is how Tertullian responds to it. I speak no evil against him whom I retain for myself. If I deny, it is to force you to prove. So he says, I'm retaining Paul for myself. He doesn't say how he's retaining him. Right? He just says, I retain him, not as an apostle. If I deny, it is to force you to prove. If I deny, it is to enforce my claim that he is mine. Otherwise, if you have your eye on our belief, accept the evidence on which it depends. If you challenge us to adopt yours, tell us the facts on which it is founded. Either prove that the things you believe really are so, or else if you have no proof, how can you believe? So he didn't say he's my apostle. He just said he's mine. Because remember, he's going to say at the very end of this that under 49:27, I believe he's bringing me food, because that's what God tells me in Genesis 49:27. But he didn't know that was a mistranslation. It's not that Paul's bringing you food. The Benjamite wolf is not bringing you food. It's eating you and killed you and is now destroying and eating and consuming the flesh of all the Gentiles. So it was not a positive. It was not distributing food, but in Greek it said distributing food, and that's why he was misled by that. But he was only accepting him in that limited sense, that there were things you could learn from Paul, but you did not have to accept he was an apostle of Jesus Christ. So we got one more quote, I think. Hold on. Now, the next thing I think is the cleverest thing, and I've actually forgotten about what his argument was here. So, Tertullian denies that Paul can have any experience in his heavenly visions that would allow him to contradict the gospel message. So, Paul everywhere in his epistles, without quoting Jesus, destroys Jesus' gospel. There's no doubt about it, because that's the whole argument of dispensationalism. He contradicts him. But what Tertullian says is Paul claims he's getting these communications in the third heaven, but then he uses the fact that Paul says, I'm not allowed to repeat any of this to you, as proof that you can't use Paul to contradict Jesus, because Jesus doesn't allow him to repeat anything that he hears there. I really forgot about it. It's a great argument. Listen to this. So this is Tertullian. Now, although Paul was carried away even to the third heaven and was caught up to paradise, this is implied in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 4, and heard certain revelations there, yet these cannot possibly seem to have qualified him for teaching another doctrine, seeing that their very nature, that they were unspeakable, was such as to render them communicable to no human being. Wow. Do you realize how perfect that was? Yeah, I should be saying that is, you know what? Everything Paul's saying, not only is just coming from him, but since he says it's unspeakable, it's not permitted for him to even say what we've told. We cannot therefore take anything he's telling us as based on anything that's communicable or understandable or intelligible or whatever. It's just he's not permitted to teach us anything that would contradict the gospel we already have, because God has already prohibited him from telling us anything that he's learning in the third heaven and repeating it to us. So Paul is caught in a trap of his own making. He said, I can't repeat any of this to you. It's unspeakable. It's illicit. It's illegal. And yet he's trying to teach us. And Tertullian is saying these are inconsistent positions. He can't be teaching us things that are illicit for him to tell us about. Very clever. Paul self-destructed. And I forgot. That was a very good argument. Let's see what else we got. Okay, and a few years later, I got challenged by somebody, so I decided to read the whole book over again, and I found another good quote. And this was early in the book. I just kind of didn't pay attention to it. Book 1, chapter 13, Tertullian is emphatic that there are only 12 apostles. So this rules out Paul. And there can only be 12 apostles due to its symbolic number. But why was it that he chose 12 apostles and not some other number? For of this number I find figurative hints up and down the Creator's dispensation in the 12 springs of Elphin, in the 12 gems of Aaron's priestly vestments, and in the 12 stones appointed by Joshua to be taken out of the Jordan and to set up the Ark of the Covenant. Now the same number of apostles was thus portended. So it's just interesting. I mean, he knows his Bible backwards and forward. I don't even know where I would start to find the springs of Elphin reference, the Aaron's priestly vestment reference, the 12 stones appointed by Joshua. I think I do remember that. The 12 rocks as you cross the Jordan River. The 12, how you set up the Ark of the Covenant with 12 things. I don't know. So, I mean, this guy is thoroughly saturated in the Word of God, better than, any of us. And he's telling us Paul is illegitimate, and he's pulling in evidence that, from his encyclopedic brain. So he doesn't depend on the internet and doing Google searches. He's got it all in his head, and he's devastating Paul. Now, I want to show you something else about the book Against Marcion, which is relevant, meaning he's criticized Paul. Now, he's denied him all his authority, being an apostle. He's not allowed to come with a gospel different than Jesus Christ, because everything he's learning of the third heaven is unspeakable, and it's illicit for him to tell us anything from there. So he basically is cutting Paul off at the knees, using Paul's own words. See? Now, what's interesting is how does Tertullian deal with the issue about Paul's views on the law? Because is he anti-Paul because Paul is against the law? And this is where Tertullian is made to appear, and I believe deliberately forged, because what he's going to say in certain parts of the book are completely contradicted by this later part of the book. So it's as if someone went in early on and weaved in a few things, because remember, and they were going to weave in just the abrogation of Sabbath and circumcision. So Sabbath is the real target of Roman Catholicism. And remember, they're the later editors. So all these books have to survive through the Constantinian purge of everything that has to do with following the Sabbath for sure. I mean, they can't let the Sabbath survive. That has to be denigrated and attacked at all costs, even if we have to go in and forge new sections to books. And that's what I'm trying to get at, is you can see things that are misplaced inside his book, don't make any sense, and are contradicted later in the book. So whoever these editors are not very clever. They don't go over and try to change anything, but put in a few things that they can say, see, he says the Sabbath is gone. So you will see this is in Against Marcion, Book 1, Chapter 20, and this is in the Shaft version. So we have Tertullian, in essence, perpetuating the book of Galatians. This is about Galatians, about the false gospel, they wanted to follow Jewish ceremonies. So, this is no longer being respectful towards the 12. They're now Jewish ceremonies. They ought to have known they were abrogated. There's a new dispensation. So you got to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that dispensationalism was a very Roman Catholic idea. Okay, and that's why they could get rid of the law and made it illegal to teach Sabbath anymore. So you got to understand, Roman Catholicism is this is Roman Catholicism at its core. But this wasn't Tertullian, no, because you're going to see he's just going to rip this apart later in the thing. So it appears, though, that he's going along with this at the time. Okay. Oh, and these things would one day cease. So this is the Roman Catholic view. To get rid of the Sabbath, they've got to inject that into his book. Okay, but now the next chapter. In the very next chapter, Tertullian lays down a warning principle applied against Marcion and against Paul implicitly on the Sabbath, due to Tertullian saying that one who contradicts Jesus' words is at risk. Tertullian noted Jesus taught, quote, "For whosoever, says he, shall be ashamed of me, of him I will be ashamed." So you basically cannot deny the words of Jesus, or else Jesus will be ashamed of you. Okay, so now we're going to get to this. He's going to talk about, now we're in book 5, where changing Tertullian around there is going to be dangerous, and it's going to show your hand that somebody's trying to fraudulently add that earlier section up here in what? Chapter verses 120, and make him look like he's in favor of that idea? I don't think so. And now it's going to say Paul is being referenced about Colossians 2:16 having abolished the law, including the Sabbath. So that's something they want to reimpose, right? This is imagine a Roman Catholic editor from the 300s is looking at this book from the 207 period, and all he's going to do is have him say, "We do not now treat of the law further than to remark that the apostle here teaches clearly how it has been abolished," meaning the Sabbath, "even by passing from shadow to substance, that is, from figurative types to reality, which is Christ." I mean, clearly the dispensational language that you would expect in the 300s post-Constantine. But really, is this really from Tertullian? We have to doubt that because of what's going to come up next. Or actually, in many places in the book, which I think was just too hard for them to edit out. Okay, so here, book 1, chapter 22. There are numerous examples of the law issuing against Marcion. For example, Tertullian mocks Marcion's view against the law's continuity by showing how removed the true Jesus was from the one who, quote, was about to sever their words and writings, that's the law and prophets, from his gospel, book 1, chapter 22. So he's just, remember I showed you from the chapter 1, verse 20, he's endorsing the book of Galatians, and now just 2 chapters later, he's talking about, it's impossible that Jesus could have ever severed the law and the prophets from his gospel. Another time, Tertullian offers proof that Jesus, quote, "rather than the demolition of the law and the prophets, we find them thus far are found effectuated in Christ," book 1, chapter 25. So now you're 5 chapters past when he's quoting Galatians as if the Sabbath law is gone. And there are dozens of examples. And so as I commented in this article that I'm reading here, in the first hour, he spends 90% of the time endorsing the law, except for that section of chapter 20, where he seems to be endorsing Galatians. And I'll highlight the 2 most glaring. So this is in Marcion. Well, look at this. Marcion, book 1, chapter 12. So this is actually 8 chapters before that. Really, I'm going to call it the infamous chapter 20, where Galatians is stuck in the middle of this book in an anomaly to say that we don't have Sabbath and we don't have circumcision. But Sabbath is what they're fighting about. The Constantinians from the 300s are injecting themselves. So here's where Tertullian faults Marcion for removing from Luke's gospel the remark, which is common with Matthew, that Jesus says, "I did not come to destroy the law or prophets." That's in Luke 16, by the way, as well. And that's from Matthew 5:17. As Tertullian puts it, quote, Marcion gagged his mouth on this word. That's book 1, chapter 20 to 12. So he's saying that Marcion didn't want to repeat that Jesus said, I did not come to destroy the law or prophets. So he takes it out of chapter 16 of Luke. Remember, Marcion's using Luke. And this is important. Tertullian adds on the Sabbath issue precisely that Jesus, by his explanation that we can do good on the Sabbath, was restoring the works of the Sabbath which were proper for it. Tertullian ends that, quote, Christ introduced nothing new. Okay, so this is chapter 12. This is 8 chapters before we get this interjection of Galatians ending Sabbath. God is, through Paul, is ending Sabbath. I mean, that's what we're supposed to assume is meant in that reference. But here, just before then, he's saying, no, Jesus is saying you restore the works to the Sabbath that are appropriate for it, good works. But obviously you retain Sabbath. If there's no Sabbath, then with the discussion, Jesus would say, this is moot. God allows work. You can do all the work you want. It's just there's no longer a holy day of Sabbath. So don't worry about it anymore. That would have been the right answer if the Sabbath had been abrogated. But to say that you can do good on the Sabbath is to affirm that you just don't do your labor that you normally do during the week. The second most glaring example is that Tertullian tells us that Marcion recounts the young rich man's question. Remember, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? To which Jesus says, obey the commands. Also putting, quote, this is Tertullian, putting the very essence of the law before the young man in the command to love God. But Marcion removes the word eternal. So the man's no longer asking how to have eternal life. Tertullian says this, in the heretical gospel, life only is mentioned without the attribute of eternal. Tertullian says the implication of Marcion's alteration is that the law-based answer was simply intended by Jesus to explain how to prolong this life. Tertullian proves that is incorrect, that in context, the young man was asking about eternal life, even if the word eternal were not present. Thus, Tertullian concludes that Jesus taught the obedience to the law was the key to eternal life. This is book 1, chapter 26. This is 6 chapters after he was just saying or implying that he agreed with Galatians that the law is all dead and gone. So this chapter 20 that's in the middle here, and I'm sure, it's just a bogus thing. Rufinus admits to doing things like this. I'm going to go back in. I'm going to make sure that we don't hear a discordant voice in the past with Origen, and I'm going in there and I'm deliberately changing somebody. Origen was writing around the same time period. 220. So if Rufinus is willing to change people writing in the 220 to sound Trinitarian and anti-law, why wouldn't he do that to a guy like Tertullian who's writing 207 AD? So he did it, and he bastardized something into chapter 20 to make it look like Galatians was on the lips of Tertullian. But you can see here, Tertullian is just consistently not cooperating with that modification. Okay. Okay, so let's see if we can find anything else here about that. And then I point out that Schaff is anxious and biased in mistranslating portions to enslave Paul. So, for example, it clearly says in Latin that Paul was the apostle of the heretics. And then this is translated by Schaff as the apostle whom the heretics adopt. I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to say it on a video. False. So somebody tried challenging me on this. It's because it's very clear. It just says hereticorum apostolos. And all he's saying is, it was just like a passing remark. He's referring to Paul, and he just says, this apostle of the heretics says this. It was just meant as a snide, now derogatory reference to Paul. That's all. Just a passing remark. And there was no basis to put in the words apostle whom the heretics adopt. It's crazy. and so this guy from Christianity 101 history or whatever, he was trying to say that can't be right, blah, 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 because I actually provided, I said in my article, I said at the time, I said Schaff mistranslated this as the apostle whom the heretics adopt. And then he refuted me to his audience and said I was lying, and said it was the apostle of the heretics. And then he said the true translation is the apostle whom the heretics adopt. Well, it turned out the guy didn't know Latin at all. So I got back to him and I said, nope, here it is. I even showed him the Latin, and I showed him a Google translator of the Latin, which agreed with me. It says apostle of the heretics. And so then he got a professor from Australia. And the guy from Australia said, well, he technically, Mr. Doug, is correct. It is apostle of the heretics. But you could, reading the whole 5 books, you could conclude it's really the apostle whom the heretics adopt, blah, 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 blah. That's not right. Translation is not, you imagine how you read 5 books and you add words. You never add words like that. You leave it alone. But it just goes to show you is, this is how things come to us. Schaff did mistranslate this to soften the words. So that's why I would go with the Oxford translation, not Schaff's translation. And I wouldn't trust Schaff. Okay. So anyway, I guess that's it. Okay. So there you go. And why did Gray not mention anything about the most negative book, and makes valid points to this day, which are valid? There is no proof that Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ from anything that is corroborative. Okay. Paul's only source is himself. And then Paul doesn't quote Jesus even saying that to himself, not in the any of the appearance accounts, which are in Acts 9, 22 and 26. Paul's own words say that once in his epistles, he's not allowed to actually communicate anything he's learning in the third heaven. So Tertullian cuts him off at the knees, says, then we can't take anything he says in his epistles as valid, as inspired, because he says he's not allowed to even tell us what he's been told. They're unspeakable. So you see, really, it's a totally destructive thing. And he says you've got to have legitimate corroborating proof that someone is an apostle of Jesus Christ. And his ultimate proof, too, was the fact that Paul went in Acts 15 to get his gospel confirmed. Now, we don't know what that was, but it meant his gospel was inferior to the 12's, and he had to conform to theirs. And so, obviously, that means if Paul's gospel is inconsistent and contradicts Jesus Christ, that means we don't have to follow it. Now, I want to get to this issue of law versus not law. Is it very clear that Marcion, his main reason why he loves Paul is it gets rid of all the law. And what does Tertullian do? He brings back the law. And so if you even accepted chapter 20, this phony chapter I'm telling you about, Galatians is stuck in the middle of chapter 1, and you can see all the pro-law statements before and afterwards by Tertullian. What's going on here is that you've got a battle of manuscripts where, the fraudulent Constantinian Christians that are weak and really not even Christians. They're frauds. They're basically perpetuating whatever Constantine wants, and they're going to change old documents to conform to Trinitarianism. You're going to see Trinity issues. You're going to see Trinity language that never existed in the early manuscripts. Okay, this is how bad these guys were. And they're going to put in there that the law, particularly Sabbath law, is abrogated. They love Galatians 3, and now ended up getting injected in here. But Tertullian otherwise is clearly refuting the idea of Marcion that the law had been abrogated. And he uses the proof of Jesus talking about how to have eternal life. And then he also uses the proof about the 12 apostles. And then he says about the appointment of the 12, he says, after Jesus has done all this and appointed the 12, why would he appoint the 13th apostle? I mean, he's established everything in order. It's as if he hadn't planned things out enough that he, now has to add a 13th sort of like by impulse. I mean, that's a very good argument too. So you see, there's nothing that Tertullian said that is contingent on assuming that there is no, a lot of people try to say, well, he's assuming we can't even cite any of our gospels because he's just, he's limiting himself to just accept Luke. No, He actually says, you, Marcion, can't rely only on Luke. You have to rely upon our gospel. So that whole argument they bring up is false. He is saying, Marcion, you're not looking at Matthew. You're not looking at Mark. So because you won't look at our gospels, you have no legitimate basis just to rely upon Luke. Because why? Because even when Paul came to be to the 12, he knew he couldn't be approved unless he sought confirmation from what had preceded. And at that time that meant Matthew and Mark. And then he makes a point that, Tertullian makes a point that Luke is an apostolic man, but he is not an apostle. So we have to look at what? The apostles, Matthew's book, because he is an apostle. See, so he is using the authority of the scripture against the validity of Paul, and it did it in an effective, destructive manner, destroyed Paul's validity. But again, as I said from the beginning, the only reason at the end of the book he says, but I will not completely forsake Paul, because I am told in Genesis 49, verse 27, that he's distributing food to me. And that's it. He doesn't say, he never says he's an apostle from the point when he starts questioning him. He never refers to him as an apostle again in this book. And he stops referring to him that way, like we do Apostle Paul all the time. He stopped doing that. He is not abiding by that anymore, because he doesn't believe that anymore. He himself has just destroyed that. But he isn't saying I'm throwing Paul out the window completely because I've been told this is how it works. Unfortunately for him, he didn't know it was a Greek mistranslation. It's not dividing the food. It's a very destructive term that the ravening Benjamite wolf will, after he killed us, murdered us initially, now he's going to come and eat and destroy us by consuming us and taking our lives. Just our physical beings will be destroyed too. So yeah, not a pleasant prophecy to contemplate. But how many Christians are ever told the Benjamite wolf prophecy? By the way, see, Tertullian knew about it. Well, we don't hear about it anymore, because once we knew the true translation of it, the second part is very bad about Paul. But when you thought it was positive, the Benjamite wolf prophecy was used in Tertullian's age to prove the validity of Paul. That was all they had to hold on to Paul, was the Benjamite wolf prophecy, but had to be in a mistranslation. And then, so Jerome cited it. Several others cited the Benjamite wolf prophecy. But once the Hebrew came to be better known, you don't hear about it anymore, because it's anti-Paul. It becomes an anti-Paul remark if you cite Benjamite wolf prophecy, because it's only negative, both in the beginning of his career and the end of his career. Okay, so I think that covered Tertullian, which is a very deep topic, as you can see, thoroughly. And Gray had no basis, absolutely no basis, to say that Paul was, how can I put it? That Tertullian is not rebuking Paul. He is rebuking the validity of Paul being an apostle of Jesus Christ. That is 100% fact. He is rebuking any Christian relying upon Paul for anything that cannot be found in the Gospels of Jesus Christ. Okay, and that means excluding Luke. He's talking about Matthew, and he's rebuking relying upon anything that Paul says while he's in the third heaven, which is basically everything. In other words, he's never quoting Jesus in that. So he is rebuking us, the Christian community, from putting reliance on Paul in areas we shouldn't. But on the other hand, he's saying you should still listen to him because he has some food that supposedly we need to get, and that's what Genesis 49 verse 27 was telling him. That is not the same thing as giving him an endorsement for everything. Quite the opposite. It's just, if you find some useful food, he thought God was saying we have to go get that food from him, but it's not what it said. It's really we're going to be continually. He not only killed us in the beginning, the Benjamite wolf in sheep's clothing, but he's also going to consume us and try to destroy us completely. After, even our flesh, he's going to come eat, which is, he's going to finish us off. And we can't let that happen, Gentiles, right? We're going to fight against this force, this evil force of the Benjamite wolf. Okay, God bless everyone. We'll get to the next episode. I think there's more.